invisible bilingualism. So what is this invisible bilingualism? When you choose to ignore in the bilingualism of a community or the children in your class or the people that you interact with, this is called invisible bilingualism. So we just choose to ignore it, and more often than not, it is done in schools. So you have several bilingual children in your schools, but you simply ignore as if you don't know about the fact that they have and they can use different languages. Now, what is happening now and what will happen more and more as we move into the 21st century is that we have technology now that facilitates translanguaging. And more people will not need just one language but several languages to interact with communities who can now cross the borders or the concrete borders of their countries and meet with you in a virtual environment, discuss or issues and come together in the case of a common cause. So when we say translanguaging, please remember that it is not just a hodgepodge mixing of language which might seem odd to you. This is done with a specific way, subconsciously again, and more often than not, it is a single language whose grammatical structure is used to map out the other aspects of the language. For instance, when my little girl was learning Urdu, coming from England, then she would say something very odd like, the balloon is phat. Now, when we translanguage, we never say balloon is phat. So even this code switching is odd because it does not somehow fit. So even when languages are mixed and items from languages are borrowed, then even it is a systematic mixing of languages. And to ignore this complexity itself and reduce it to calling, for instance, Spanglish, or ignoring it because this is the blacks' way of speaking English, it diminishes the significance it has for the bilinguals. So what we often do is judge our translanguaging from the perspective of monolinguals. For instance, how many times you talk to some elites who are very class conscious and they would say with certain pride that they don't know how to write Urdu and they don't know how to put all that in Urdu. This is not something to be proud of. Rather, it is a disability not to be able to translanguage in a rich bilingual environment. So translanguaging means practices using a wider repertoire of languages that you know, and the end is not a deficit language, how it might be interpreted by some political agenda or some monolingual standards. Rather, it is actually a resonation of cross-cultural understandings, and it is a whole complex way of talking about things which only the bilinguals can do. So, what we are doing in translanguaging, as I said, we are using only a larger reservoir of languages. We are being more rich in vocabulary. We have different ways of explaining the same reality. Not only the same reality, we are able to explain the same phenomenon from another perspective or another cultural outlook. So it makes your imagination more creative and richer rather than doing something bad to it, with what is seen as interference by another language labeled by monolinguals. So, what we do through translanguaging is we encourage multiple ways of thinking, imagining, and expressing facts.